Hello everybody, it's your friendly digital technology librarian, Christy here. We've reached another Friday, so of course I have another Film Rec Friday ready for everybody out there. Now this week we are doing things a little bit differently. I know almost every week we usually focus on recommendations available on our streaming services, but this week all bets are off. We are using both streaming options as well as those available through our traditional CleveNet means, so physical media. And that's because we are going to be talking all about Jane Austen adaptations. A few weeks ago, Netflix released a new adaptation of Jane Austen's Persuasion that's been getting a lot of buzz, both positive and negative. Some people have really loved the period look of the film with its more contemporary styled dialogue and sensibility. Some people have absolutely hated it. Some people love the idea of colorblind casting. Some people, for them, it takes them out of the storyline. Totally respectable opinions, whatever line you fall on, whether you loved it, whether you hated it, whether you loved aspects of it, whether you hated aspects of it. The main thing is, it's gotten a ton of people talking about Jane Austen, and that's really fantastic for someone like me. I love Jane Austen. I am always thrilled to talk about Jane Austen and argue about Jane Austen. I have definitive versions of all of her stories that I go and watch over and over again, besides rereading the stories. So hearing people who normally don't care about Austen at all talking about this adaptation has been a lot of fun for me. So what I want to do today is recommend just a couple of my personal favorite adaptations, along with a couple that you might like, say, if you did enjoy the sort of contemporized view of the most recent release of Persuasion. And I think that will hopefully keep the Austenian momentum going forward. You know, like I said, it's always delightful to me when people want to talk about her work. So hopefully these recommendations will give you something to dive into if you have not already watched them. If you have, maybe it will remind you to check them out again. In any case, these recommendations are all, as always, available for free with the use of your Milan-Berlin library card. And without any further ado, let's get into the recs. Okay, first off, let me just say that Persuasion is actually my absolute favorite Jane Austen novel. I'm a total sucker for a second chance romance. And as a Jane Austen fan in general, it's really lovely to see how this latter novel shows off not only her ability to navigate a second chance romance, but just kind of in general shows how layered and nuanced her writing had become by the end. Her lead heroine, Anne, is just this complex and marvelously multifaceted character. And to me, out of all the many adaptations of Persuasion that there have been, whether we're talking about this really recent Netflix version, or we're talking about the one from the 1960s, or the version in the 1990s that had Amanda Root in it, the one that sort of grasps the character the most, that really rings the most true, is the Anne portrayed by Sally Hawkins in the 2007 version of Persuasion. Now, the 2007 version is not available via streaming service, but you can absolutely get it on physical DVD through our CleveNet services, so I strongly recommend that you do so. It's really, for me, the definitive filmed version of this particular story. In case you aren't already familiar with the storyline of Persuasion, one, you should be, because it's amazing. Two, go check out the novel, because the novel is phenomenal. But barring that, in Persuasion, we are dealing with Anne Elliot. When Anne was 19 years old, she fell madly in love with this young sailor, Frederick Wentworth. But Anne was part of the gentry, and anyone from the gentry would have felt themselves pretty much too high for this plain enlisted guy. And her family, and in particular a family friend, persuade her to break off the relationship. It doesn't matter that she was definitely in love with him and he was in love with her. They're just all of these familial pressures. So again, she's persuaded to break off the relationship. Everyone thinks she'll move on quickly, and she is courted by many other people, but no one ever lives up to Wentworth. And years go by, it's almost a decade, and she's still alone. She's at this point in her late 20s, and in that point of time would have been considered quite on the shelf. She would have definitely been in spinster territory. And circumstances bring Anne and Wentworth back into the same circle, only this time Wentworth has all the power. He is this highly decorated naval officer with a great deal of wealth from being in the military. Everyone has nothing but great things to say about him. Women are flinging themselves and their daughters at him, including a couple of her young relatives, which is just so frustrating to her because, again, in the beginning, everyone was like, he's not good enough. This is only going to drag the family down kind of mentality about it. And so the crux of the story is, will they manage to find their way back to one another? Because she has all of this guilt, even though she's still madly in love with him. And he's obviously resentful because he thinks she threw him away for no reason. And I'm not saying that she didn't, but she was young, she was impressionable, and you have everyone telling you that this is wrong. And so it's this struggle to get to a place where they can remember who they were when they first met, because they were absolutely in love with one another. And as mentioned, I absolutely love a second chance romance, so this story definitely totally resonates for me. I think it's gorgeous. Really, almost any of the iterations that I've seen, I've enjoyed to some degree. So when I say this one is like the definitive version, again, at least for me, I really, really mean it. You've got a ridiculous cast list on this particular version. You've got, as mentioned, Sally Hawkins as Anne Wentworth, or as Anne Elliot. Sally Hawkins is brilliant in pretty much everything she's in, but she's particularly good as Anne, and sort of pulling all of those layers back. So you see, again, like the guilt and the sadness and the longing, and there's some versions of this story where, you know, it automatically feels like it's inevitable that they'll find one another again and that they'll be able to fall in love again. And not that that's not the way that a lot of Austenian stories go, you know, A plus B equals C. But at the same time, you want within this story for there to be that push and pull where you get the sense that things could go the other way. And I think Hawkins really does a good job of sinking into that uncertainty. You've also got Rupert Penry Jones playing Wentworth. He's fantastic in it. Though I will say, Kieran Hines as Wentworth in the 1995 version is also exceptionally good as Wentworth. You also have Anthony Head from the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series playing Anne's father, Sir Walter. Alice Krieg, who was the Borg Queen in the Star Trek Next Generation film. She plays the sort of incredibly influential Lady Russell, who is one of the pivotal reasons for Anne's decision to originally split up with Wentworth. You've got Tobias Menzies, who was also in Game of Thrones. He played Edmund. He plays William Elliot, who is one of Anne's distant relatives. He's also a very pivotal character in the story. I mean, top to bottom, whether you're talking about the main characters or side characters, it's just a ridiculous, ridiculous cast. And they're so good at portraying these characters. It definitely feels the truest to me out of all of the different adaptations. And I'm not someone who needs to have like 100% accuracy. I think it's more the spirit of the character. So, you know, even if this had been a contemporary version or whatever, the portrayal is really the most important part for me, and it definitely comes across in this. Um, if you are looking for a slightly more period feeling version of Persuasion, definitely check out the 2007 adaptation. The acting across the board, top marks. The costuming, the setting, the direction, everything. It's just really, really well done. So if you did enjoy the recent adaptation from Netflix and you're looking for just to see another take on the story, if you hated the most recent version, definitely check this out. I think you'll really, really love it no matter what. So again, available on DVD, Persuasion from 2007. Must watch. Okay, so moving on to my next recommendation. This one is also not available via streaming service, but it is available on DVD and Blu-ray via our traditional CleveNet service, and I strongly recommend you check it out. That's 1995's Clueless. I love this movie so, so much. I loved it when it came out in the 90s. I love it today when it's actually considered vintage. That's horrifying. It is just so much fun. And this is actually Amy Heckerling's loose adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma. So instead of the beautiful English countryside, we are dealing with the heart of Beverly Hills. And rather than a heroine named Emma, we've got a heroine named Cher Horowitz. Horowitz, right? That's right, isn't it? Yes. Cher's father is this rich, powerful litigator. She is the queen bee at her high school. Everyone wants to be friends with her, or wants to be her. Everyone wants to date her. She's just the center of her community, which very much the same thing with Emma Woodhouse in the original Emma story. So when we meet Cher, she's got her high school life all figured out. She knows who her closest friends are. She knows what she likes to do on the weekends, which is just party and will be seen and enjoy all of her frivolous activities, like you do. And then she ends up, like, for reasons I won't go into because I don't want to give away stuff if you haven't seen it, because you absolutely need to. She ends up matchmaking a couple of her teachers, one of which is played by the incomparable Wallace Shawn. He's delightful in this teeny tiny role, but he's still so, so amazing. Anyway, she gets this taste for do-gooding, as she frequently puts it, and she decides she wants to help other people. She really enjoyed seeing how these two teachers found each other and are now happier. So she meets this new student named Ty Frazier, and she decides to give her a makeover and change her life. And in a lot of ways she does. It seems really superficially frivolous, but reaching out to Ty, sort of bringing her into her circle, really does change things. Some things for the better, some things absolutely for the worse. But it still shows that she does have a well-meaning heart. Let's put it that way. Amidst all of this maneuvering and manipulating, she also has this rather contentious relationship with her former stepbrother. Former because her father was very, very briefly married to his mother, but that was years ago, and his mother is already remarried and blah, blah, blah. It's a portrait of American marriage in the 90s, I guess. Or at least from that particular tax bracket, I suppose. Anyway, that stepbrother is played by Paul Rudd, as mentioned, who is amazing in this, as he is in everything. And we see them bicker and fight throughout the storyline. He's very clearly Mr. Knightley from Emma. And it's really interesting to see how those two characters interact in a relatable way. So you've got, on this one hand, a very kind-hearted, though incredibly superficial and shallow character who doesn't really think outside the box of her life. She is incredibly privileged as the child of this incredibly wealthy, powerful man. She, even through that, manages to have a very kind heart, is thinking of other people. She really does take care of her father. She just has a lot of holes in the way she looks at things. Um, Her stepbrother Josh, on the other hand, is very aware of the world. He's very, very much conscious of social justice and social injustice. While the father is this really, stepfather, I guess, for him, is this really powerful, wealthy litigator. He wants to go into environmental law. He wants to save the world. And even though they have seemingly very little in common, they still work very well. And so their relationship is a massive, massive part of the storyline. And it's really fun to watch. I mean, the two of them are really cute. It's like puppies chasing their tails. It's super adorable. Um, you do get a lot of hit points from Emma as far as your basic storyline goes. All of them very intelligently contemporized. So, as mentioned, rather than the English countryside, we're in the heart of Beverly Hills. Rather than this gossipy group of unmarried and married women, we've got just high school cliques. Um, Teachers instead of governesses and nannies. You've got um, a lot of other little modernizations that make a lot of sense. And your villains in this are really, really fantastic. It's very interesting to see a modern version of an Austen villain, because they're very easily identifiable. Like that kind of, that trope has not disappeared or really shifted that much, because the, I guess, primary antagonist in the early part of this story feels very organic. I mean, he doesn't feel out of place, and his behavior is not particularly different from the behavior of the character in the original work. So that's kind of something to think about, how bad people are bad people no matter what century we're in, or country, or setting, or anything. So yeah, it's Clueless is one of those delightful stories that will absolutely make you smile. That will make you giggle at references, because again, it's 20 years out. So even the 1990s, you can point back and be like, oh, I remember those trends, removed from Emma altogether, just from American 90s fashion and touch points and things like that. If you like uh, really, really funny dialogue and silly dialogue, romance, you have to watch Clueless. It is so, so good. If you've never watched it before, you're in for a treat. If you have watched it and it's been years, you owe it to yourself to watch it again, because this movie is just that good. Again, available via our CleveNet service on DVD and Blu-ray. 1995's Clueless, my pick of the week. Okay, moving on finally to recommendations available via our streaming services. The first of those is available on Hoopla Digital, and that is 1999's adaptation of Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park is a particularly solid recommendation if you like your Austen adaptations to have a more traditional period look and feel. In Mansfield Park, we're primarily following Fanny Price from early childhood to adulthood. She is sent from her home to live with significantly wealthier relatives at Mansfield Park. And that's where we see her grow up. She's very, very smart, but she also is very good about always seeming to be obedient and willing to toe the line, primarily because she's kind of treated like a second class citizen in this family unit that she's got. She has her very wealthy aunt and uncle, and then she's just this poor relative who's been sent to live with them to essentially mooch off of them. But she does have a really close relationship with her cousin Edmund. They grow up together. They're incredibly good friends. And you see that very much, whether we're talking about the book or we're talking about the movie. And once she becomes an adult, it's no longer just about how to juggle her place in this family unit that she's been forced into. It's also having to interact with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, how they view her, she is part of this wealthy family, but she's also like kind of viewed as this moocher off of the family as well. It's very complex and very Austenian. Um, but that's where a lot of the drama from the story comes from. Her interactions with other people they meet. She meets a lot of really decent people, but she meets a ton of schemers as well. This particular adaptation is interesting because rather than strictly adhering to the traditional novel storyline, it throws in pieces of Austen's actual life as well as certain other settings that are in no way, shape, or form part of the novel. So that's definitely interesting. But I will say, this is a really good movie. I mean, I really, really like this film. Um, when it first came out, I remember thinking it was absolutely gorgeous. I don't know that watching it today and having read Mansfield Park critically, I would say the same things, but I definitely think this is a really good adaptation, primarily because of the acting. Um, Fanny is played by Frances O'Connor, who is able to pick up all the nuances of the character. Again, like I said, she's very, very smart, and that's very clear from the get go. But she's also made to be small publicly, and she makes herself look and feel small in relation to those wealthy relatives. But at the same time, she's also very sure of herself. Maybe not, how she's going to manage in the world, but definitely who she is. She has a clear viewpoint of right and wrong, and she's just a really interesting heroine, especially for this time period, just because you've got that fascinating kind of dual nature going on, and that's a really important part of the story. Her relationship with Edmund is really, really beautiful too, like seeing it, you know, shift from one thing to the next, and seeing like the heartache that definitely gets tied into the shift in their relationship is also really, really amazing. The villains in this story are fascinating, primarily because, unlike some of Austen's other villains, these ones are in ways simply taking advantage of the way things are. They're making the most of their situation. There are other villains in this that are definitely just awful, but I do like that there are a few nefarious characters that make more sense than just being mustache twirler kind of people. Uh, I do think the elements that have been added certainly add a different layer to the story. I don't know that it would have lost that much not having them in there. And I don't want to talk about those too much because I don't want to detract from someone who's not familiar with Mansfield Park. Because if you're not familiar with the story at all, the additions are not going to take anything away. It's just like I said, if you are familiar, you might be like, was that in the book? Because that's definitely what happened to me. Um, anyway, as mentioned, the acting is really, really fantastic. Whether you're talking about um, your main character, Frances O'Connor, if you're talking about the gentleman who plays Edmund, Johnny Lee Miller, you've just got some really, really solid performances in here. And if that's one of the things that you say you may have missed in the recent adaptation of Persuasion, because I would say for me the acting wasn't really that strong in the most recent adaptation. If you're looking for a story that does have ridiculously solid acting, this is one that I would 100% recommend. So whether you are familiar with Mansfield Park, whether you have no clue about that particular storyline, I 100% think you should check out the 1999 version. It is available on Hoopla Digital, so it's a really quick and accessible watch, and I don't think you'll regret it. Okay, final pick of this week. This one is also available on Hoopla Digital, and that is 2004's Bride and Prejudice. And yes, I did say Bride and Prejudice. If you couldn't guess, this is in fact an adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is also a contemporized Bollywood musical adaptation of it as well. Uh, and it's just a lot of fun. I gotta say, this one is loads and loads of fun. So in Bride and Prejudice, we're dealing with an adaptation from Gurinder Chadha. Now, Chadha is also the director of Bend It Like Beckham. She definitely knows her genre work, and she's just managed to create this really enjoyable film that still has all of these shout outs to the original work, but that really makes it its own thing. So, if you are a fan of Austen's Pride and Prejudice, you will definitely get all of those references. But even if you are not a fan of Pride and Prejudice, maybe you've never read the novel, maybe you've never seen any of the adaptations, it doesn't matter because this film totally stands on its own. In Bride and Prejudice, we're dealing with primarily Lolita. Lolita is our Elizabeth Bennet crossover. She is this fierce, independent young woman living in India. She's got kind of a ridiculous family, but she loves them all very, very much. When her friend is engaged to be married to a young man who she met through an arrangement with her from her parents, uh, all of the traditional Indian wedding practices are brought into play. So Lolita is suddenly introduced to many of her friend's fiancés, other close acquaintances and friends who are primarily in the UK or in America, and they're all coming over to India, and it's definitely a fish out of water situation for a lot of them. And one of them in particular is Will Darcy. Of course, that's Darcy. And he's played by Martin Henderson. Lolita is played by Aishwarya Rai, who is one of the biggest Indian actresses out there. She's amazing. I've seen her in so many things, and she's absolutely glorious in all of them. Anyway, uh, just like in your traditional story of Pride and Prejudice, your two main characters do not hit it off at all. Will is incredibly insensitive. He's definitely kind of a jerk, very privileged, very entitled. And it rubs Lolita the wrong way from the moment they meet. Uh, Much like Pride and Prejudice, that carries over for quite a bit of the story, but the chemistry is there from the get go. And that's one of those things that's really, really fascinating to me. No matter what adaptation you're talking about, they almost always manage to cast people who have really, really, really strong chemistry. It doesn't matter if you're talking about the classic miniseries with Jennifer Ella and, oh shoot, I'm totally blanking on his name at the moment, but that Colin Firth. I can't believe I forgot his name. Whether you're talking about Jennifer Ella or Colin Firth, or if you're talking about Matthew Macfadyen and Keira Knightley in the more recent adaptation, I mean, all of these people, it sizzles from the get go. It totally sizzles here too, and it's really fun to watch that happen to Bollywood choreography and music. I don't even know. Um, this was a Bollywood adaptation I never would have expected, but totally needed. Besides the story being really entertaining and working well, I will say that the things that they contemporized and had to shift because it just makes more sense to shift them really work with the story. The acting is really solid. The music's a lot of fun. I absolutely love a couple of the songs. I kept on humming them long afterward. And the choreography is great. Even more than that, though, like the production quality is so good. The costumes are gorgeous. There's so much color, and it's just amazing when you watch it on screen. Like it's just like bursts of color everywhere. So it's just one of those films that makes you smile and that you really will enjoy as you go along, and hum to long after it's over. Uh, The storyline is, as mentioned, when they do make the changes, they make sense, but other than certain spots where they had to make it make sense in a contemporary society, it's really easy to follow if you're a Pride and Prejudice fan. Things always make sense. The chronology of the characters, the arcs really work well. I will say that their Mr. Collins is probably my most favorite, or it's hard to have a favorite Mr. Collins. Uh, he's the Collins I dislike the least. um, and that's saying something because I mean, Mr. Collins is in general pretty designed to really make your skin kind of crawl. And this one, he's weird and you don't like him, but there are a couple of scenes where you're like, oh, he's not that bad. He's okay, I guess. Um, and I appreciated that. Because I do think that that's one of those characters that it's not a mustache twirler, but it's definitely like clearly this guy is not someone we're gonna like. Um, and did really appreciate that. Um, so if you're looking for something a little bit out there as far as adaptations go, if you like Bollywood, if you like musicals in general, 100% recommend Bride and Prejudice. It's loads of fun, and I think you'll have a really good time with it. Okay, so those were my Austenian recommendations for this week. If you have a favorite Jane Austen adaptations that you would like to recommend to fellow fans, please comment with those below. As mentioned, I'm a massive Jane Austen fan, and I would love to check out some adaptations that I haven't seen so far, so that would be awesome. If you have any recommendations for themes you'd like to see us cover in the future, comment with those too. Definitely always looking for help there. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. I love doing these recommendation videos in general, but this one was especially fun for me because it's always really cool to be able to sort of see what's out there as far as Austen adaptations go. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out this episode. Again, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye!